Bradley Pierce, welcome to the program. I'm delighted to have you on today, in part because you're saying some things about the pro-life movement that I've been thinking, and I wanted to have you on to say them out loud. In some cases, maybe to agree with you. In a couple of cases, to challenge you just a little bit, perhaps. But one of the things that has really struck me about the pro-life movement is that it has become, pretty um, segregated. It's moved into silos, and I'm going to dramatically oversimplify, and you can of course correct me if you feel, but there's sort of the abolitionist movement and the incrementalist movement is kind of the way I think about it. You might have different um, uh, nomenclature for that. And it seems like these two camps just can't quite get along with each other in a lot of ways. I would say I would put you more in the abolitionist camp. Is that a fair assessment?
That's where I put myself. Yes, sir.
And
Depending on what people mean by that, but yes.
yeah, well, okay, so let's start there. What do you mean by that? You say you self-identify as an abolitionist. What do you mean by that?
Definitely. Yeah, what I mean by that is, I mean, first of all, what the word actually says, which is that this is what I want to do about abortion. This is what I think we should do about abortion. That is to abolish it. Pro-life in itself, it's, for life. Okay, we're all for that, but it's not really action oriented. It's very generic. So what do we want to do about abortion? Well, we want to abolish it. That is not, I mean, yes, I want to see it eradicated, but we live in a sinful world. I'm not expecting that until Christ eradicates all sin, but to make it illegal, right? Just the same way that we abolished slavery in the United States and many countries, abolished abortion by making it illegal. And in this case, making it illegal by equal protection, the same laws to protect born people, same laws against homicides to protect people before they're born. So, kind of at the most basic level, that's what I mean by abolitionist. But beyond that, what I mean and what most abolitionists mean is that we start with what God says, right? What does God say we should do? He's the authority. He's the only way we can speak with moral authority to our culture, is by saying, here's what God says. Otherwise, it's just Bradley Pierce's opinion, and that's not really worth a whole lot. And so we've got to say what God says, and we've got to say it's him who says it and claim his authority. And then what does he say in this area? He says, you shall not murder. You shall not show partiality in judgment, right? We judge harm to a child before birth the same as harm to someone after birth. And that's how we should do it in our laws. And then God doesn't say that we should regulate the circumstances. He said we should outlaw it as a crime. And so that's where we have a lot of disagreement with brothers who may call themselves incrementalists or smash mouth incrementalists. Is that, well, that's not how God says to deal with it. In fact, if we're doing it with partiality, he explicitly says, do not do that.
Well, Bradley, let me push gently back on that
Yeah.
because I think I fundamentally agree with what you're saying here, and I think probably many of our listeners would fundamentally agree with that as well. But is it possible that it can be a both and strategy? In other words, cannot we have a belief, fundamental belief that abortion is wrong in all circumstances and that it should be outlawed, just as murder is outlawed? But on the other hand, until we get there, can we take incremental steps? Can we deal with facts and circumstances? Can we make laws that will make abortion more restrictive in the hope and prayer of saving lives, of having fewer abortions in this country? Is that not an honorable approach?
Well, I think it's certainly well-meaning. It's certainly something that we've been trying to do for over 50, now 52 years coming up. And but it's not really working very well. Just at its base, we have more abortions now than we even did 10 years ago, even before the Dobbs case. Even in states that have supposed, total bans, there's more abortions now than there were even 5 years ago, before Dobbs. So, it's not working. But even more fundamentally than that, it's there's one increment that's definitely not open to us, and that is what God calls partiality. He says, "You shall not show partiality in judgment." And what he means by that, or what he says he means by that, in Hebrew, is to regard faces. So we cannot write laws that have different outcomes based solely upon the identity of the parties to the case. So if we say, well, this person's white and this person's black, or this person's male or female, or rich or powerful, or strong or weak, or born or unborn, or the father or the mother, right? Then that's where God says that's partiality. You are forbidden from doing that. He repeats that throughout Scripture over and over. He's impartial. We should be impartial in judgment. And so the problem is that's 90% of the increments that we're talking about is exactly that. So God explicitly says those are forbidden, those are not open to us.
I want to come back to that point in just a minute, Bradley, to get you to respond to some nuances of the law there. But before I do that, there's something that you said that I want you to say a little bit more about. Now, I'm not necessarily expecting you to be fluent in the statistics, though if you are, I would be delighted with that. But I wrote an article a couple of years ago and about, you know, are is the article that I wrote was, is Donald Trump the most pro-life president ever? And I dug into the statistics, and now this was several years ago. And
Right.
one of the things that I found out confirms what you just said, and that is that there are more abortions now than ever before. I mean, Donald Trump was supposed to defund uh, Planned Parenthood in the year after he was elected. The Planned Parenthood got more government funds and more private charity funds than it had ever in its history. We now have chemical abortions that are, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of hard to tell how many abortions there are because there are so many chemical abortions these days. But I would just reiterate what you just said, that despite having supposedly elected a pro-life president, despite overturning Roe, we have more abortions in this country than ever before. And I think a lot of pro-lifers don't, or people that call themselves pro-lifers, haven't accepted that reality as sort of exhibit A in the case that this incremental approach is failing us.
Right. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. We prepared a report on exactly this on our website, faa.life/SMA for self-managed abortion. People can find out about that and see the latest data on that. Or you can even go to the Society of Family Planning, which is a pro-abortion source, but they're tracking the abortion numbers that are no longer being reported to states. The states where there's the pro-life states where these bans have been passed. Um, they're no longer being reported by abortion clinics because they're no longer doing abortions. But there's still abortions happening there, and there is data out there, but a lot of people either don't know about it or are just kind of like closing their ears and their eyes, like, I don't want to know about it. I just want to live and thinking that my state's abortion free. And that's one reason we created a documentary, 6 episodes, abortionfree.com, for people to find out what's really going on, why is it going on, what's the real numbers, and what should Christians do about it. So folks can dive deeper into those numbers and kind of the
Yeah, yeah.
background behind that there.
Well, let me ask you to, and I know you're a lawyer, and your expertise is primarily legal, and the solutions that you are proposing are primarily legal solutions that you want to make abortion illegal. Um, but I do think that it would be disingenuous not to at least consider culture in this legal conversation. Laws reflect the culture. Laws teach. Laws have a
Right.
didactic function in the culture as well. And one thing that I've heard some folks say that if we make abortion illegal at the federal and state level at every single state, there will be abortions in this country because we haven't won the cultural battle. That we may be able to ramrod a legal solution, such as going back, such as Dred Scott was, such as Roe v. Wade was, right? I mean, Roe v. Wade was an overreaching um, of the courts attempting to impose a legal regimen on this country that the country, fundamentally wouldn't stand for. But the opposite could also be true. So how do you talk about or think about the cultural issues vis-a-vis the legal issues. In other words,
Right.
you got to, in other
Yeah.
words, we can, we might, I mean, maybe at some future day be able to ramrod a legal solution down the throats of the American people. That doesn't seem to me to be the right answer to this problem.
Well, I think it's, when we talk about culture or law, it's really a both and. Culture, is reflected in the law, and law also impacts the culture. And so we have to be, this is a parallel tracks that we need to be seeking legal change, and we need to be seeking cultural change. Um, and by seeking the legal change, that's one way that we have these conversations, because a lot of people have, especially in this day and age, there's so much attention on the political realm, on government, on politics. That's what a lot of people are talking about. And so whenever you have things going on, if you have bills being considered, well, that helps to be a catalyst for that cultural conversation that we need to have. There will always be people, though, in the culture that, there's really three functions when we were talking about criminal law here. There is the didactic function, like you said. The law is a tutor, as scripture says. It teaches people, here's, in this case, the value of life, when life begins, how we're treating life. Hopefully people, that impacts the culture and people's come to agree with that. But then there will always be people who don't agree with that. And then that's the second function of the law, which is to deter, to restrain conduct. People who don't agree with the reason for the law, they're then, restrained by the penalty of the law, the fear of that penalty. And then if that restraint does not keep them from committing that great evil, then there's justice, right? There's justice for the victim. This is why it ultimately comes back to, God speaks not just to the heart; He also speaks to the law, and He speaks to, yes, here's where our hearts should be. Yes, here's how we should value life, made in His image. Here's why we should love it. We should love our neighbor, and all of this. But then He also says we should have laws, and we should have laws that make it illegal to murder people.
Bradley, we're not going to be able to unpack every idea that both your docuseries and your body of work has presented before us today, but I did want to dive into a couple of maybe lightning
Yeah.
round issues. Since the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, 14 states have outlawed abortion, right or wrong?
Depending on what we mean by that, right? They have
Exactly. Sort of a trick question there, isn't it? Yeah.
right. That's the way most pro-life people have been told that by pro-life organizations, that hey, there's 14 abortion-free states, where abortion's illegal. It's like, well, it's illegal for everyone except for the mother, right? That's why you see abortion clinics closed. A lot of them some of them are still open, and they're referring for abortion or doing contraceptives or things like that. So there are still some Planned Parenthoods in those states, but they're not doing abortions, hopefully, or like supposedly at least, or at least the law prohibits it. And so, what abortions are still happening there? Well, there are abortions still happening there that are still 100% legal under the pro-life bills, because in every one of those states, the pro-life bills wrote in says this doesn't apply to the mother. So homicide, this doesn't apply to the mother. Bans from conception, this doesn't apply to the mother. Chemical abortion, drug-inducing abortion pill, bans, this doesn't apply to the mother, which means that it's still totally legal for mothers to order, possess, take pills in those states to cause the death of their own children right there in the quote unquote comfort of their own home. And that's what they're doing. They're ordering the pills online, getting them delivered. In many cases, doing telehealth, so they're talking to doctors in other states, and then getting those pills delivered into the state, and doing those abortions at home, and that's totally legal under those pro-life laws, unfortunately.
So the 14 states outlawed abortion, but not really. That means that there's really no state in the country where abortion is illegal under all circumstances,
Exactly.
which is the position that you hold. So abortions are taking place everywhere from sea to shining sea throughout this throughout the
Yeah.
fruited plain right
Well, and
now.
not just taking place, because there's murder of born people taking place in all 50 states too, but it's illegal, right? So
Yeah.
it's way lower numbers than it otherwise would be. But that's kind of the way that I look. One thing just to help people kind of visualize this, and that is that, or conceptualize it, and that is the abolition of slavery. Dobbs overturned Roe, but we're not really after like the Civil War, right? We haven't abolished slavery in all 50 states. We're not even right before the Civil War, where slavery had been abolished. 1850 had been abolished in many states, right? The northern states. We're in 1750, where slavery is legal in all 50 states. That's where we still are today. There's not a single state that's outlawed it. There's some regulation of it, but not if you're the mother.
Right. Okay. So the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, your organization, has, however, um, um, come out in favor of some bills in Louisiana, in Ohio, for example, but they're just bills, right? There's not a. Am I right in saying that there's not a single state in the nation that has passed a law that you folks at the Foundation to Abolish Abortion would say this is the model legislation, this is the model law? Is that accurate?
That's true. Either the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. We believe that from the moment of fertilization, human beings, that we're all persons, right? A person, a human being are just synonyms. And so states are required to provide equal protection of the laws. Of what laws? Laws protecting life at the very least. And so that means homicide laws. So there's no state in the country that said, all right, our homicide laws that protect born people also protect preborn people equally. That does not exist. That's what we draft. We draft those bills for states around the country. There's been dozens of those bills that have been introduced around the country over the last 8 years or 9 years now, but none of those have passed yet. And but we're still working.
Yeah. Well, given that, let me ask you to I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, and I'm guessing that you might claim that that
Definitely.
accolade as well. So looking into the future is always a tricky business, but given the realities that you and I have, I think we're in more or less agreement on that Roe didn't end abortion, that rather Dobbs didn't end abortion, overturning Roe did not end abortion, and in fact, abortions are more prevalent in this country than ever before, and that only 14 states have passed any sort of abortion restrictions. That, according to my math, at least 36 states that are still wide open. Is that accurate?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're wide open, right? There's still a lot of those that are Republican controlled, and so they have regulations. Some of those, a couple of those have heartbeat bills that have passed. Many others of those have, some kind of regulation, 20 week, 15 week, something like that.
Yeah.
Um, but again,
But
when it comes
bottom
to the mother,
line,
there's zero.
so some progress if you're an incrementalist, but still a lot of abortions taking place in virtually every state in the nation. You've already conceded that there are only a few states, Louisiana, Ohio, et cetera, um, that are even considering laws that you would approve of. So this is clearly going to be a long game for you guys.
Right.
What are and let's just stipulate for the record that the end of the long game is the abolition of abortion. At least that's that's your desired outcome. But what are the incremental steps? I hate to
Right.
say incremental steps,
Yeah.
but let's just
No,
say
and
what are the
again,
next steps? What
yeah, and I don't have
what
a problem with the word increments. It's what do we mean when we're talking
Yeah,
about
what are
that?
y'all's, in other words, what maybe a better way to say it, what are y'all's priorities in the next year, the next 5 years to move this country closer to an abortion-free America?
Yeah, well, I think, continuing to introduce legislation keeps the conversation front of mind, continuing to rally legislators around that, see godly legislators elected, in support of that, bringing this issue to the forefront of Christians. If Christians would become repentant on this issue, repentant for either apathy or for compromising principles and refusing to do what God says to do on this issue. Um, if Christians would wake up and start acting, I mean, things would turn around very quickly. Just like God said, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then he'll hear from heaven and heal our land. Yeah, I think that still applies, and I think we would see that. So that's the kind of increments that introducing these bills are catalysts to those conversations and waking people up. They let people know, like we're talking about here, that hey, your state is not abortion free in spite of what you're being told, and really bringing the truth to people. And really, we see that the gospel is what changes hearts and minds more than that truly changes hearts and minds. And so we want to be bringing that. That's what we're all about. And we're about proclaiming the authority of God because it's ultimately His opinion that matters, not mine. And we have to be doing so using His word, which is powerful, sharper than a two-edged sword. We can't just be abandoning that. And we believe that if we do the way we put it, God's will, God's ways, then He'll bless that. And that's ultimately what that's the kind of increments that we need is His blessing this city, His blessing this state, His blessing this bill, His blessing this legislator, His blessing this, one step at a time increments, if you want to call it that. Are they godly increments? Are they us trusting in Him and doing His will, His ways? Then that's what we're all for. One person, one heart, one podcast at a time, making it happen.
Yeah. Well, Bradley Pierce, speaking of one podcast at a time, I appreciate you being on this podcast. But before we leave, just anything that I'm not smart enough to ask you, you want to make sure that you leave our audience with today?
Well, probably not because you're not smart enough, but it's only so much time. I just people check out abortionfree.com. I think it'll answer a whole lot of questions if people, if this has piqued their interest and they want to learn more. And really, I just say we can't just we think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. We can't just be like priests and Levites. Like, hey, I'm not beating people up and leaving them for dead on the side of the road, so I'm okay, right? As long as I'm not aborting my children, I'm okay. Well, no, there's people who are being led to the slaughter, as Proverbs says. There are people dead and dying on the side of the road that we as a church need to be the good neighbor, need to be the good, reaching good Samaritan, reaching out to them. And that's the duty of the church. That's the duty of every Christian, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's what Christ tells us to do. So I would just say, everybody examine your heart and your actions. Are you truly doing that?
Bradley Pierce, that's a good word to leave on. Thank you so much for being on the program today. God bless you.
Thanks.